Welcome back. What was once considered an issue for the future has quickly become a current concern as many local and elected leaders join the fight against climate change. The Inflation Reduction Act is one of many efforts used to address the effects of climate change. Joining me now for discussion on the Inflation Reduction Act is CEO of Urban Green Council, John Mandyck. John, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Kibin. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Now, can you tell me a little bit more about the Inflation Reduction Act?
The Inflation Reduction Act is huge, Kibin. It represents the single largest investment in energy efficiency in the history of our country. And the broad goal here is to reduce our climate emissions 40% by 2030. This is exactly the type of action we need to combat the climate crisis that we see each and every day here in New York City and across the world.
Now, I know there are so many ways the act will combat issues of climate change, but can you just highlight a few that kind of stood out to you?
Well, for me, what stands out is a $9 billion investment in energy efficiency. This is for appliances, for systems within a building, a home, an office, to encourage people to use less energy. When we use less energy, we burn less fossil fuels at power plants. And when we burn less fossil fuels at power plants, we reduce carbon emissions and climate change overall. So this investment in energy efficiency is really, really important and one that will move the needle significantly in our work to stem the worst effects of climate change.
Okay, so just to clarify, you may have touched on it, but I know the act will support the transition to clean energy, lowering energy costs for people across the country. Is that kind of like what you're talking about right now?
Well, there's those two separate things going on there. The first is the act will move our sources for electricity to renewable sources that don't burn carbon. That's important. But that's going to take time. Those are big infrastructure projects that we need. In the interim, we have to reduce the amount of energy that we use for the existing fossil fuel electrical plants. And that's what the energy efficiency piece is about. So there's two really important components going on here. First is how do we move to cleaner energy overall? And then in the process of doing that, how do we use less energy as a society?
Now, I'm curious to know, do you think this will encourage more Americans to reduce their carbon footprint?
Absolutely, in a number of ways. Let's just keep on the discussion we've been talking about. When Americans invest in energy efficient appliances, heating systems, cooling systems, hot water systems in their home, they're going to be reducing their carbon footprint. That's important for places like New York City. 70% of our carbon emissions come from buildings. And so when we reduce the amount of energy we're using in those buildings, we make a huge difference when it comes to climate change.
Now, I'm curious to know, do those appliances tend to be a little bit more expensive, or is that just a misconception?
Well, there's an acquisition cost, right? And so what we have to do in New York is we have to replace steam-based radiator systems with electrical heat pumps. Today, those radiator systems are burning fuel, oil, or natural gas in the basement of the building, creating carbon emissions right there on the site. And by the way, creating health pollutants by burning those fuels. When we plug those systems into the electrical grid that becomes green over time, we reduce that carbon footprint. So there is an acquisition cost to buying those new heating and cooling systems. And the Inflation Reduction Act provides big incentives to do that, up to $4,000, for example, to install an energy efficient heat pump into those homes and apartments to replace the steam or fossil fuel based systems that are there today.
That kind of leads to my next point. Like, I know the bill is expected to assist Americans economically as well with the creation of new jobs and funding for lower income communities. Can you explain why this was important to add?
Well, sure. I mean, we need to transition our economy to green jobs, and this law will do that. It will create significant demand for building retrofits for these appliances that we've been talking about, and somebody has to do all that good work. And so it's going to create jobs, great jobs, green jobs in the installation of heat pumps and retrofitting buildings and making buildings more energy efficient. On top of that, it directs resources where they're needed to low to moderate income communities and environmental justice communities. I mean, just alone, the EPA will provide $4.5 billion in block grants for environmental justice projects in environmental justice communities. And so those are things that we have to encourage with electrification, with ways that we can promote health while reducing climate impacts at the same time.
So we talked a little bit about the buildings, and I just got this idea. I know that a lot of the buildings in New York City are very, very old. I think some are like even from like maybe the 80s or even earlier. Can you explain how challenging will that be to kind of update it and make it more green?
Sure. 90% of the buildings we'll have in New York City are the buildings we have. I'm sorry, let me start over. 90% of the buildings we'll have in 2050 in New York City are the buildings we have today. So if we want to reduce our carbon footprint for the long term in New York City, we have to look at our existing buildings. And some of them are 100 years old, 200 years old. So it's a challenge for sure, but it's not impossible. And laws like the IRA provide the tools necessary and, frankly, the funding necessary to help us to tackle those big challenges.
Now, environmental justice leaders like Congressman Richie Torres cites pollution and similar environmental issues as one of the many causes of poor health in communities like the Bronx. How does the act address the issue of environmental racism and the disproportionate health effects it has on low-income communities?
Yeah, I'm really excited that the act is starting to address this issue, which is long overdue. Three quick examples. I'd mentioned this before, but there's $4.5 billion for electrification in low to moderate income communities. That's to help people do exactly what we were talking about, move from fossil fuel-based heating systems to electrical heating systems. There's $3 billion in block grants from the EPA to do projects in environmental justice communities that can address health along with climate. And there's another $1 billion from HUD to improve the sustainability and affordable housing. And those are just a few categories. So the act is really significant from that standpoint.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about fossil fuels because I know when we have these conversations, that comes up a lot. And it tends to be one of New York City's biggest challenges in the fight against climate change. What are some ways New York City contributes to the creation of fossil fuels?
Sure. Well, our biggest issue in New York are buildings. So if you think of all of the climate emissions in New York City, 70% come from buildings. And then 20% more or a little bit more comes from transportation, and then some from waste. So when you talk about reducing the effects of climate change in New York, you have to talk about reducing the use of fossil fuels used by buildings. And buildings use fossil fuels in two ways. They use it for lights and power. So when you turn on a switch that for electricity, that powers a power plant that could be 100 miles away that's producing the electricity. That power plant is burning natural gas that's creating the climate emission. That's a fossil fuel. The second way that buildings contribute to this is what we've been talking about is for heating and hot water. So in the basements of our buildings, particularly our residential buildings, we're burning oil or natural gas, which are fossil fuels, to create heat and hot water. Actually, that application right there is our single largest source of carbon emissions in New York City. It's from furnaces, boilers, and hot water heaters that are providing the heat and hot water for the city.
Now, I know your organization actually contributed to some of the changes that we are hopefully going to see. Can you explain when New Yorkers can expect to see these changes?
Sure. I mean, the changes have already started. And we have two big laws that are guiding us from a buildings perspective. So we have Local Law 97, which is a world-leading law that places carbon caps on large buildings in New York City to reduce those climate emissions. Those caps start in 2024, so that's not that far away. And then we have Local Law 154, which phases out fossil fuels in new construction. And that's coming on board too. And so we have these two big laws that'll impact the buildings community that are right on our doorstep.
And I understand that this is not going to include places like restaurants or hospitals. Can you quickly explain why?
Sure. Well, I think you're referring to Local Law 154, which is the phase out of fossil fuels in new construction. There are a couple categories where alternatives aren't available yet, or you need that assured backup power. So, in a hospital, um, you want backup power for resiliency, and that backup power might come from a fossil fuel. And so, that's the reasoning behind hospitals is for resiliency and also some specialty labs. When it comes to restaurants, in some cases, we don't have electrical alternatives across the board yet for all commercial restaurant cooking equipment. And so it's a matter of time for technology to catch up.
Now, I think this is a really great start. Can you just let everybody know what they can do to stay in touch with your organization and probably learn some tips on what they can do in their personal lives to be a little bit more environmentally friendly?
Sure, well, visit our website, urbangreencouncil.org. We spend a lot of time on our website making sure that we're providing the right data at the right place at the right time to help people understand the role we can take with the buildings community to reduce carbon emissions overall.
That's all for our show today. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Kibin Alleyne, wishing you and yours safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.